Hi folks, this is author Hugh B. Long, author of science fiction and fantasy infused with Viking mythology. Welcome to my podcast. Welcome to Star Wolves, a space opera. Science fiction infused with Viking mythology. Book 1 in the Tribes of Yggdrasil series. Star Wolves, Chapter 1. Year 2128. Planet Niflheim. Star Alnitak AB. Overchieftain Egemen sat on his throne like a well-fed lion, lethargic yet extremely dangerous. The pale blue skin of his muscled limbs rested on the arms of his throne, his eyes fixated on the two subjects standing before him. Flanking Egemen were the various advisors and servants. Immediately to his right sat his son and heir, Devrim, a Hrymar of much smaller stature than his sire, smaller than most Hrymar, in fact. Egemen despised the fact that his only son was a meek runt among a race that prided themselves on physical prowess and aggression. The Overchieftain's advisor, a stocky, milk-skinned Dvergar named Zekel, who was always calculating, spoke up.
My lord, we have a dispute between two brothers from a minor noble house. Some question of a profit from the sale of slaves.
Dvergar were known to be the most ruthless race when it came to business. The whole of Dvergar society was based around the concept of commerce and profit, and in fact they had no separate government at all, only a megalithic corporation, the Sons of Ivaldi Incorporated, that ruled with ruthless fiscal efficiency. Given their economic and technical acumen, many leaders employed Dvergar as advisors. Two young Hrymar stepped up before the Overchieftain and bowed. Zekel's eyes explored the forms of the brothers hungrily, a twisted smile forming on his mouth. My lord, the first brother bowed and the second followed suit. Egemen asked, Why do you bring this dispute before me today? Did you not try to resolve this by combat? Yes, my lord, we did, said the second brother. We conducted 2 trials of combat on our family's holding. The young man looked very sheepish. Both were fought to a draw. We feared a third contest would kill one of us and leave our sire short-handed. Egemen looked disgusted. Feared being killed, so your sire would not be short-handed. How considerate. He glanced over at his son. See how thoughtful such sons are, Devrim. Would that I had such a son. Devrim knew he was being sarcastic, but it stung nonetheless. I will address your problem at once. He stood and strode down the 3 steps and stopped in front of the 2 brothers, looking them up and down, sizing them up. Without a sound, he drew the dagger hanging at his belt and thrust it up through the chin of the first brother, so far up that the tip protruded through the top of the boy's skull. A sickening gurgle and rush of blood were the last living acts of the young Hrymar's body. The second brother stood still as stone, a long wet patch forming on his leg, the smell of piss wafting off him. Egemen held the first man's lifeless body, locked eye to eye with him. How dare you trouble your Overchieftain with such trivialities? He seethed. One of you may have died in combat, with honor. Now both of your lives are forfeit. He let the young man's corpse drop to the floor. Zekel, the other one is for you. Take him as a body slave. With cruel delight, Zekel stared into the young man's eyes. Let him live long so he can remember what it might have been like to live as a free man. Zekel's appetites were well known at court, and this slave's life would be nigh unbearable, filled with constant shame and horror.
Thank you, my lord. You are most generous.
Zekel snapped his fingers, and 2 guards grabbed the young Hrymar and dragged him out. The boy was stunned and speechless. Egemen turned nonchalantly, wiping the blood from his dagger on a pant leg, and then bound up the 3 steps to his throne. A second petitioner was ushered forward, This one an old man, judging by his simple clothing, no friend to the nobles. With trembling hands, he approached Egemen and threw himself prostrate on the floor. "Speak," Egemen commanded. "What is your name, citizen?"
"I am Nerman," the man stammered.
"Steel yourself, old father. Why have you come before your overchieftain? I hope you're not planning to waste my time like those two." He paused and glared at Nerman. "Stand up. Address me as a free man."
Nerman stood. "Yes, my lord. I have news of great import."
When the old man didn't continue, Egemen had to prompt him. "Then get to it."
Of course. We have learned of a race as yet unknown to us. We were mining on an asteroid out on the edge of Cygnus, Alfar territory, and we picked up communication between an unknown ship and an Alfar vessel. The occupants of the ship referred to themselves as human."
Egemen leaned forward on his throne. "Human? Are you sure?"
Nerman nodded. "Yes, my lord."
"Did you learn anything more, such as where they are from?"
"No, my lord. It was a brief communication. All we heard was that the captain of the vessel was on his way to a planet around Epsilon Eridani with some important news, and he wouldn't say more until he arrived."
"Did you scan the ship?"
"Yes, my lord. We were able to do a brief passive scan. We did not want to use active scanners, to avoid detection. I mean, we were illegally in Alfar territory after all. But we did discover the hyperspace signature was nearly identical to those of Alfar ships. But the hull was not organically grown like theirs. It seemed to be made of some metal and fiber composites. That is all we could determine with passive sensors, sire."
"Human. The prophecy," Egemen trailed off. "We need to find out more about these humans. A growing empire has need of new slaves and resources." "Sirkan!" Egemen barked. "Yes, lord." Sirkan stood at attention beside his master. Sirkan was an impressive specimen, tall and heavily muscled, his face replete with scars, a testimony to his years of hard service. "I want you to take a scout ship and see if you can't learn more about these humans. Take my offspring along." He gestured to Devrim. Sirkan bowed. "At once." Devrim didn't acknowledge the insult overtly, but inside, the insult had landed like one more fieldstone on a pile. The growing cairn would topple someday. "I'll make you proud, sire," Devrim said. "I doubt that." He waved at Devrim dismissively. Devrim bowed and hurried out of the throne room. Devrim returned to his quarters in a low mood. He always left Egemen feeling this way. His life was a series of failed attempts to please his overchieftain, his sire. He lived in the shadow of the most ruthless overchieftain in history, the only one to ever bring all of Niflheim under one yoke. Egemon alone united all the 12 Hrymar tribes. Previously they had cooperated, albeit loosely, infrequently, and rarely for long. And now, for nearly 10 years, Egemen had been the overchieftain of all the Hrymar. His rule was brutal and absolute, but productive. Never had the Hrymar accomplished so much. Their numbers grew, and their sector of space became more secure. Now their interests crept beyond those borders. By Hrymar law, Devrim should not have been allowed to live. They suffered no aberrations in the gene pool. In 10 years of breeding with his harem, Devrim had been the first child born alive, and as such, Egemen was rude to leave him out on the ice to die, as he should have rightly done. Devrim knew this, and was never sure to be glad or not. Had he been born whole, a true Hrymar, his life would have been one of relative ease and privilege, being born into the Jarl class, which was an honor. The life of a Jarl in Hrymar society was one of leadership, duty, and reward. Being born a weakling, as he was, his was a life of shame. In ancient times, the weak among the Hrymar were made part of the thrall class, essentially slaves, and served the Carl, or middle class, and the Jarl, or ruling class. The Carls became the craftsmen, and ostensibly the middle class. After the Hrymar civilization grew beyond Niflheim, they soon took other races as thralls to serve them. Subsequently, any Hrymar born weak, deformed, or generally found lacking physically was left exposed on the frozen surface of Niflheim to die. The Jarls argued this made for a stronger race. Devrim began packing a small bag in preparation for his trip with Serkan. He picked up his dagger, which was the twin of the one his sire had used to kill the boy earlier in the day. He looked at it, considering it carefully. Only the ruling family and trusted servants were permitted weapons in the presence of the overchieftain. This law was established early on in Hrymar history and reduced the number of assassinations to more civilized levels. Although undersized by Hrymar standards, a runt by all accounts, Devrim was a master with his dagger. He had to be. Unarmed, he had no advantage, but with a blade in hand, the playing field became level, if not tilted, in Devrim's favor. Being smaller, he was a more challenging target, and his lack of size and muscle mass were compensated for by his dexterity and reaction speed. He never revealed his skill. To do so would be to give up one of the few advantages he had, and in the treacherous court of Egemen, one needed every advantage. A knock on the door pulled Devrim from his reflection. "Enter," said Devrim. Serkan opened the door. "My lord, our ship is prepared and we are ready to depart." Devrim looked over to Serkan. "I am ready." Devrim picked up his bag and stepped towards Serkan, then stopped in the doorway. "Why does my sire despise me, Serkan? I know I do not measure up to our greatest warriors, but I am fit to rule. There's more to ruling than brawn." "He is a hard man, my lord. It took a hard man to bind all the Hrymar together. The hardest of men, in fact. Had you been sired by any other chief, you would have the respect I know you crave and justly deserve," Serkan said with a bow. "I have to do something, Serkan. I must find a way to distinguish myself, lest I find myself without a future should my sire die. Or be killed." Devrim lingered on the last word. "The ship is ready, my lord, and your sire wants us gone within the hour." Devrim walked up to Serkan and stood before him, almost nose to nose. "You served my sire well, Serkan." Devrim locked eyes with him. "Would you serve me also?" "If you are named successor, I will serve you till I die, my lord." "Good. Good. Shall we?" Devrim gestured with his hand. Serkan nodded, "My lord," and walked. Devrim made his way down the corridor from his quarters and into the common area, and then on to the tunnels outside the palace. The entire population of Niflheim lived deep beneath the planet's surface. From the Dvergar, the dwarf-like race from a neighboring star system, they purchased plasma-based boring machines for rapid tunneling. And although the temperature never got above freezing in the depths of Niflheim, with the Dvergar tunneling technology and Niflheim's abundant geothermal energy, the Hrymar were able to make good use of the planet's resources. The apparently lifeless ball of ice was home to boundless underground lichen and fungi farms, with thousands of species and manyfold uses. The fungi and lichen were their food, building materials, and their clothing. Some even suspected certain species possessed intelligence, although rudimentary. Devrim stood on a platform with several sets of tunnels bored into each side. A long, tubular maglev train raced out of one of the tunnels and abruptly stopped before him, hissing as its doors opened. He stepped across the threshold and stood just inside the door, grabbing a bar above his head for balance. The public trains on Niflheim were capable of speeds in excess of 1,000 kilometers per hour, and with a smooth rush, the transport accelerated into the other end of the tunnel and on into darkness. All Devrim could hear was the steady hiss and whoosh of the maglev car racing through the tunnel. His mind mulling over his task. Humans, he thought. Perhaps this was his opportunity to distinguish himself, if he could capture one. Before he had time to fully develop the thought, the maglev train decelerated and stopped. "Uze terminal," an artificial voice announced. Devrim stepped through the train's door and was greeted with a blast of frigid wind. He shivered and picked up his pace as he hustled up to the small scout ship. He saw Serkan talking with one of the ground crew prepping their ship, the Dogon, and walked over to them. Their scout ship was a small vessel, only about 40 meters long and weighing in at 100 tons. It was jump-capable, however, and could also enter planetary atmospheres. Larger ships, such as many of those in the Hrymar Stellar Navy, were confined to space and docked at orbiting stations. The Dogan traded weapons and armor for range and was armed with only a single plasma cannon turret. "My lord," Sirkan said, bowing his head. The crewman also bowed his head with respect. Devrim nodded and strode up the ramp into the ship. He sauntered through the ship into the cockpit and then sat down into one of the two chairs. He was looking forward to getting off planet. Trips like this were a rare opportunity to forget his sire's displeasure, for a time, and marvel at the scope of the multiverse. Niflheim was a bleak planet, frozen, and yet with its myriad hues of blues and whites and grays, it still managed a measure of beauty. Sirkan hunkered down beside Devrim, and when the ship's hatch closed with a clunk, Sirkan began his pre-flight checks. The powerful vibration of the ship's antimatter reactor began to ripple through them as it warmed up. Shortly, the vibrations dampened, stopped altogether, and the console lit up all green. "Uze Terminal, scout ship Dogan, ready for departure," Sirkan announced. "All clear, Dogan," came the reply. "Let's go find some humans, my lord." Devrim nodded silently. Chapter 2. Planet, unnamed, star, Procyon A. Brother will fight and kill each other. Sister's children will defile kinship. It is a harsh world. Whoredom is rife. An axe age, a sword age. Shields are riven. A wind age, a wolf age. Before the world goes headlong, no man will have worst mercy on another. Voluspa. A silvery white star, Procyon A, hung low in the sky, caressing the horizon and bathing the landscape in pearly beams of light. It reminded Haldor of the bleak Arctic nights back on Earth. Growing up in Oslo, he'd learned to appreciate the generous summer days where the sun never set, though, as if in payment for that privilege, the Arctic nights were equally long and not nearly so pleasant. Standing at the edge of a crater, he watched as Procyon B, a white dwarf and little brother to Procyon A, crept above the horizon. It was an awesome sight, two milky siblings greeting the day. A malicious wind interrupted his musing and tore his jacket's hood down from his head, allowing sleet to dampen his hair. The wind's icy fingers began piercing his body, burning Haldor's skin wherever it gained purchase. Pulling his hood back up, he shivered and then marched toward his shuttle amid deafening thunderclaps, wincing with each eruption. The thunder evoked his grandfather's tales of Thor fighting the frost giants. "When you hear thunder, boy," his grandfather had said, "you know Thor is doing battle with the Jotuns." Haldor missed those stories. Even his name reflected those tales. Halar, Thor, meant the stone of Thor in Old Norse. Haldor Olsen, or just Hal to his friends, was a spiritual man. He honored the Norse gods, both the Aesir and the Vanir, as his forefathers had done. 1,000 years past, his ancestors regaled their children with tales of the old gods, of Jotuns, dragons, and the great wars. Those tales became legend, the legends became myth, and the myths were soon faded memories on crumbling parchment. The coming of Christianity and the advent of technology replaced the old stories with new ones, and men soon forgot the desire for valor and honor. They cared only for the acquisition of new things and to live ever more hedonistically. Once men began to ply the Stygian oceans between the stars, they began to rediscover the truth of those myths. They were not alone, as many wanted to believe. The multiverse was indeed a place of danger, filled with the evils of old legends, although this realization would not come fast enough. A red strobe illuminated the area under the ramp of Hal's shuttle. He pressed a button on the remote at his wrist, then with a whine and a pop and some hissing, the ramp began to lower, allowing the florid interior lighting to seep out. Hal was relieved that he would soon have a reprieve from the frigid wind and driving sleet. Although it was a short distance from the crater to his shuttle, it seemed an infinitely long walk. The ramp made audible contact with the ground, after which he homed in on the warmth of the shuttle's interior. Seated in the navigator's chair was a youngish East Indian woman who swiveled around to stare at him, with her electric blue eyes and crooked smile. "About time you got here," she chided. "Loki's balls, woman, it's freezing out there." "It is. You look a bit like a wet cat," Neela said, laughing. Hal smiled. "The ship ready to go?" "Prepped and ready, boss." "All the data we need collected? Done and done." "Good. Let's go home." As the ramp clanked and closed, Hal flopped into the chair beside Neela and strapped himself into his harness. The shuttle accelerated smoothly out of the planet's Arctic atmosphere. From orbit, the planet was striking, with subtle shades of cobalt, sapphire, cerulean, and beryl. It was truly mesmerizing. Though Hal only had to remember what it had been like to walk the 100 meters back from the crater to remind him of the planet's less attractive aspect. Like a rose with its thorns, he thought. As the shuttle approached the survey ship SSS Leta in orbit around Procyon Zeta, her docking bay doors opened silently, and the shuttle navigated into its assigned berth. Hal stepped out of the shuttle into the stale but warm atmosphere of the Leta. The docking bay was quiet. Although the Leta was a solar-inclusive democracy starship, a military ship, she was a survey vessel and not a ship of war, and as such it was a fairly tranquil atmosphere. Only one deckhand worked in the shuttle bay. Most of the crew on duty were either at their scientific monitoring stations on the bridge or analyzing data in a computer lab. This was a drastic contrast to the times Hal had served on any of the SID warships, which were buzzing with frenetic activity 24/7. He stepped gingerly over several bulkheads and took an abbreviated set of stairs to the bridge where Cahaya perched like a hawk in his command chair. Cahaya was a wizened old Indonesian man with a wispy white beard, and he stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed in at just over 100 pounds soaking wet. What he lacked for in physical stature he made up for with his commanding presence. There was no doubt who the captain was on this ship. In private, he was the polar opposite, giggling, smiling, almost a silly little man, but few got to see that side of him. But Hal was one of those few. "Hal, how was the view?" Cahaya asked. "Stunning. It's a frozen jewel. I wouldn't want to colonize it, but I'm sure somebody will find a use for the mineral deposits under all that ice." "I am certain. Sadly, my crew does not permit me to have any adventure. I must be content with views out the bridge window." He smiled at Hal and motioned to the view. 2 silvery stars and a swirling blue marble, the planet, filled the view screen. Hard not to appreciate. From orbit, Hal qualified his thought. "We're calculating the jump back to New Midgard now. We should have you home in about 10 hours. "Sounds good. Let's hope my wife has dinner ready for me," Hal said with a wink. "You need a good Indonesian girl. My wife can cook for 1,000 men. None leaves hungry," Cahaya said in his thick Austronesian accent. With a grin, Hal replied, "I'm sure, but my wife might object, old friend." He might make the odd misogynistic joke, but he adored his wife, Siobhan. "Well, sometimes you trade them in for a new model," Cahaya winked. "And why aren't you cooking dinner for her? She deserves it for putting up with your nonsense, Hal," Neela said as she walked onto the bridge. They all chuckled. Cahaya pressed a button on the arm of his command chair and spoke. "Crew, prepare for jump to hyperspace." The lighting on the bridge phased from the standard full-spectrum white to a dull yellow. Everyone took a seat and buckled in. When the ship's computer detected all passengers and crew secure, the lighting on the bridge changed to red. There was a momentary feeling of disorientation and the sensation of falling, just briefly, and then all returned to normal. But now they were in the inky black embrace of hyperspace. The lighting on the bridge reverted to its original white. Planet, New Midgard. Star, Epsilon Eridani. The Leta dropped back into normal space with a shudder. Over the comm system came the strangely alluring voice of the ship's computer. "We have arrived in the Epsilon Eridani system. Next stop, New Midgard. ETA 5 hours. Hal looked over at Neela. "What are you up to for the next couple of weeks?" "Oh, I'm going home to New Delhi to visit my parents. They keep pestering me to visit, and if I don't go soon, they'll show up here," she giggled. Haldor was relieved to be home. He missed his son terribly. At 5 years old, little Aelin was always coming up with something interesting. His antics were the most cherished part of Hal's life. He never imagined he would love anyone as much as his wife, but when their son was born, well, there were no words to describe it. He told Aelin daily that he loved him more than the sun and the moon and the stars, and that always made Aelin giggle. Although he didn't quite know what it meant, he just knew that his dad was smiling and laughing, and that was always enough. Hal had visited dozens of planets in his job with the Colonial Survey Service, and always tried to bring back an interesting rock or mineral sample for Aelin, who now had a collection rivaling most colonial museums. New Midgard was humanity's first extrasolar colony, which they'd established after making first contact with the enigmatic Alfar over 100 years ago. They'd named the colony in honor for the Old Norse word for earth, Midgard. Haldor keyed a button on his wrist comm, heard a beeping, and then his wife's voice. "Hello? Guess who's coming home for dinner?" "Hi, darling. How was the trip?" Siobhan asked. "Good. Uneventful, really. Just glad to be home. How are the crops looking?" "Wait till you see the corn. The tomatoes are doing really well, too. The ultrasonic transmitters are doing a wonderful job keeping the pests away." "Great. I'm looking forward to seeing some of that corn on the cob this summer. I should be home in a few hours. How's Aelin?" "Out chasing animals, no doubt. Listen, I'll let you go. I'm in the middle of 1,000 things. I'll see you when you get home. Kisses." "Okay, bye." Haldor keyed his wrist comm again. When a tone announced the shuttle's imminent landing, Haldor and Neela got up and collected their bags, then made their way to the disembarkation ramp. Hal shot her a smile. "You have a safe trip back to New Delhi." "Thanks, boss, and give Siobhan and Aelin my love." "Will do. See you in a couple of weeks. Rested and ready for action, right? With 16 nieces and nephews, I cannot guarantee the rested part." She laughed and walked off. Hal's electric ground car arrived quietly at his farm, 10 kilometers outside the capital city of Norvik. Most settlers on New Midgard ran small farmsteads in addition to contributing whatever other talents they had. Hal had spent most of his time surveying nearby planets for suitability as future colony sites. His wife Siobhan was a botanist who, in addition to managing their farm, conducted research on local flora for the New Midgard Ministry of Agriculture. The colony had been founded in 2120 and was barely 7 years old. 9,000 people called it home, with new settlers arriving each month. Life here was good. Not that life on Earth had been so bad recently. 70 years ago, Earth had completely redesigned its energy economy and migrated from fossil fuel burning to an energy economy based entirely on hydrogen fuel cells, high-efficiency solar and wind power. The entire infrastructure became renewable and non-polluting, as well as accessible to all. All of this was made possible after the implementation of the global digital democracy, a fully inclusive, instantaneous electronic voting system that transformed world governments. People now have the ability and legal obligation to vote directly on issues. The world's population could now come to a true consensus on issues, unhampered by lobbyist influence or lopsided representation. It was inevitable that when the voices of all people on Earth could be heard, they united. The individual countries on Earth, as well as the colonies on Moon and Mars, voted to form one solar system-wide government. The solar inclusive democracy was born. Hal climbed out of his electric car and took a deep breath of the fresh air. Recycled air on a starship was never great, no matter how efficient the atmospheric scrubbers. He inhaled deeply and letting the muted scent of grass and pollens linger in his nose. He sauntered over to a cornfield bordering his grassy yard and gazed out at a rippling sea of gold. He reveled in the simple beauty of his own food growing. Of course, his crop would help feed others as well, but they were his fields. He watched as some of the robotic farm tenders wandered the fields, analyzing soil pH, moisture levels, and ensuring there were no pests. These tiny, semi-autonomous robots removed much of the drudgery normally associated with farming. Attached to the side of the house was a greenhouse where his wife conducted research and where she grew herbs and plants during the longish winter season. He saw her bending over a plant, pruning and generally fussing over it. He crept in quietly, stooped behind her and put his hands over her eyes. She spun around and threw her arms around him. "Hey, handsome." "Hello, beautiful." He kissed her deeply and then paused to say, "Flowers are coming up nicely." "They really are." She turned around and picked up a pot. "Look at this orchid." He glanced at the brilliant fuchsia flower. "Doesn't hold a candle to a little Irish lass I know." He kissed her again. "Where's Aelin?" "Oh, he'll be bug hunting around the house." She waved dismissively. "I have one of the farm tenders following him." "Okay, I have a few new mineral samples for him." She smiled. "Not like he needs more rocks. His room's already overflowing with them, just like his da, eh?" she said, throwing up her hands. Hal's study was brimming with rock samples from a dozen planets and asteroids. But that was work, he rationalized. He'd been collecting rock samples since he was Aelin's age and turned this hobby into a career. Second only to his rock collection was Hal's collection of bladed weapons, which lined the wall of his study and almost every other room in the Olsen household. Siobhan had declared their bedroom a blade-free zone, though. Few people knew Hal was capable of wielding any weapon in his collection to deadly effect. Most guests saw them only as quaint wall decorations. Hal found his son and the farm tender, or at least what was left of it. Aelin was sitting behind the house, screwdriver in hand, with pieces of the farm tender lying scattered in front of him. He saw his father, sprang up and ran to him, giving him a tight squeeze. "Daddy!" Kneeling, Hal hugged him back. "What happened to the farm tender, buddy?" "It was broke, so I fixed it." He beamed. "You did? Oh my. Let's not fix these little fellas anymore, okay?" Hal shook his head. "If they're broken, come ask Mommy or Daddy to help." With a frown, Aelin replied, "Okay. I've got something for you." "A present?" Aelin's eyes went wide. "Yep." Hal pulled out a glistening green and black mineral the size of his thumb and handed it to his son. "Thanks, Daddy. I'm going to go put it in my room right now." Aelin sprinted off, clutching his prize tightly. Being a dad was a good job, Hal thought. Siobhan and Aelin were a light in the darkness for Hal. Hal's own parents died when he was a teenager, which had left a void in his life, one he'd found impossible to fill, until he met Siobhan. Now Hal couldn't even recall with any clarity how those dark days felt. They were fully banished, replaced by the warmth and light of his wife and son. Planet, Earth, star, Sol. Kate Feisel strained to open one of the double doors leading into the CEO's office. Ben Gritterman looked up from his desk as Kate closed the door behind her office. "Good morning, Mr. Gritterman," Kate said, smiling. He managed to produce a half smile from his wrinkled face. "What have you got?" "The latest research on the telomere stabilization protocols." "Well?" He motioned for her to pass him the papers. Kate handed him the dossier. She always got nervous around him, despite working for him for 6 months now. As CEO of the GAPA Corporation, which had a near monopoly on antimatter production, he was one of the richest men on the planet, so who wouldn't be a little intimidated around him? Antimatter reactors were confined to use solely in space due to the risks an accident can pose. On a starship or a space station, a reactor was designed to be jettisoned. If not for the terrestrial ban on antimatter reactors, Gritterman might be the richest man on the entire solar system. Gritterman was 76 years old, and although modern medicine was highly advanced, humans still only averaged a 95-year lifespan. And for Gritterman, this simply wasn't acceptable. He was used to succeeding in everything he did, always being able to solve the problem through the application of intellect, money, or force. Old age was a foe he was failing to conquer. After the first contact with the Alfar over 100 years ago, humans learned their new friends lived, on average, 500 years, over 5 times the span of a human being. They explained that this was simply a function of life on their planet, the Josselfheim, or simply Alfheim. Alfar-born and other planetary colonies had lifespans much shorter, though still about double a human's. For the Alfar, the difference between lifespans of their colonies was not a great mystery to be solved. It just was, and they accepted it. For a few years after first contact, humanity discussed the possibility of researching ways to replicate the conditions on Alfheim and reproduce the secrets to their long lives. Ultimately, mankind made the sensible decision, guided by the wisdom of the Alfar, to give up that pursuit. Earth had been at a breaking point with the population. It had long exceeded its carrying capacity, which was a euphemism for the planet's inability to support humans' unrestrained proliferation and consumption of resources. Quintupling the age of Homo sapiens would push humanity over the brink. the SID banned any further research into Alfar aging. But not everyone gave up the dream. Gritterman was leafing through the report. "Goddamn disappointing progress," he muttered, and shook his head. "I pay these useless assholes a fortune, and for what?" He looked up at Kate.
"I'm sure they're trying, sir."
"My father had a saying, Miss Faisal. There is no trying, only doing. He was a prick, but I still like the quote. What we need are tissue samples from an Alfar, or an Alfar volunteer if possible. Based on what I read here, the limited DNA samples we have aren't enough."
"Sir, that's a tall order. Contact with the Alfar is tightly controlled, as you well know. Typically, only government officials have access to them."
He glared at her as he leaned forward. "Then buy me a key government official, Miss Faisal. Better yet, buy me an Alfar." Planet, New Midgard. After a week of playing farmer and getting some much-needed rest, Hal had been called back to work to meet with his boss, New Midgard's governor, Andrew Zielinski. The drive into Norvik was joyful. Various species of local trees lined the road, flowers filled the ditches, and the aroma was intoxicating. One of the mandates when humans colonized New Midgard was to strike a better balance with nature. Their colony was self-sufficient by design, and everything was done with a New Midgard first policy. Humans were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the previous centuries. Although the last 100 years had seen drastic reforms on Earth, she was still in a slow recovery, and its citizens were still learning to live in harmony with her. New Midgard was a clean slate, a do-over, and so far, so good. Norvik and its surrounding agricultural homesteads were the only settlement on New Midgard, and were now bustling with over 9,000 residents. Hal parked his car in front of the Midgard Administrative Center, affectionately known as the MAC. The MAC was a 5-story office building, the penthouse of which also served as the governor's residence. The MAC was a part of a modular technology the SID had co-developed with the Alfar to enable rapid colonization. Prefabricated colonization modules, or PCMs. The MAC was a colonization administration module, which language lovers pointed out was a palindrome for MAC. Other options included agricultural modules, mining modules, terraforming modules, and so forth. To install the various PCMs, a cargo ship would drop the PCM at its target location, after which the PCM would decompress, initiate all systems, and perform a self-diagnosis. In a matter of a few hours, an agricultural colony like New Midgard could be operational and self-sufficient. The MAC, all PCMs in fact, were a paragon of environmental integration. All the MAC's windows doubled as solar panels, and in between the windows on the outer walls of the building were a plethora of mosses and plants. The roof acted as an herb garden for the restaurants on the first floor, and all water and waste were 100% recycled and reused. After Hal had grabbed a double espresso at Stellar Joe's on the main floor of the MAC, he hopped the contragrav elevator to the 5th floor. Christy Harden, an attractive 30-something brunette, and the governor's aide was waiting in the 5th floor lobby when Hal stepped out. "Well, hi there, Christy," Hal said, smiling.
"Hi, Hal. Nice to see you again. It's been a while."
Christy was a pleasant young woman with the uncanny ability to herd cats, and this had proven useful in a fledgling administration. "Sure has. You're looking great. New hair?"
"Yes, thank you. So sweet of you to notice.
Let's get you in to see the governor." Christy ushered Hal into the governor's office, which was adjacent to his living quarters. Governor Zielinski was pacing and talking on the Stellarcom when they walked in. The regal, ebony face of SID President Dalia Rukundo filled his wall monitor. 115 years ago, man had unlocked instructions to contact an alien race, the Alfar, and part of those instructions included plans for a communication device that worked instantaneously across the stars. The technology relied on the creation of microscopic Einstein-Rosen bridges, also known as wormholes. The device was naturally called an Einstein-Rosen bridge transceiver, or ERBT. Most folks simply called it the Stellarcom. A Stellarcom required the presence of a planetary-sized gravity well, so they couldn't be deployed aboard starships. Yeah. Thanks, Madam President," said Zielinski. "I'll talk to you next week." The Stellarcom disconnected and the wall monitor went black. The governor sat down behind the desk. "Morning, Governor," said Hal. "How are things back on Earth?" "Good morning, Hal. Good, actually. No problems on Earth this week, for a change, and no troubles here to report. The calm before the storm? He put on a questioning look and laughed. Hal smiled. Nice to hear.
Governor, do you need anything more from me? If not, I'll let you and Hal get started, Christie asked.
I see Hal's already got a coffee, although he didn't think to bring his boss one. This could reflect badly on his year-end performance review. Zelinsky smiled and winked. He and Hal had been friends for going on 10 years and knew each other quite well. We're fine, Christie, thanks.
He took a seat in one of the deep leather chairs in a semicircle in front of the governor's desk. He inhaled deeply and reveled in the natural smell of the leather. Everything on a starship was synthetic, and you missed these little things. He heard the door close behind them. What's up, boss? I was supposed to be off for another week. Something urgent, I take it?
Yeah, some pretty heavy stuff, actually. You probably know ever since the Yggdrasil Codex was discovered in 2013 that scientists have continued to try to find evidence of further secrets embedded in the runic script on the stones. Well, they hadn't made much progress until a few weeks ago. They decrypted another set of coordinates, a subset of the data which contained the constellations originally discovered. These coordinates aren't just the stars that form the constellations, but additional points in space very close to those stars.
What are they?
No clue yet. The consensus is that we send a team to investigate in parallel with continued decryption efforts. Our plan is to dispatch a couple of our folks to Alfheim, partner up with their people, and then perform a joint recon of the first point. We'll visit the location closest to Alfheim first.
I assume that means you want me?
Absolutely. We want you to lead the team. In addition to your surveying and exogeology background, being the great-great-grandson of the man who cracked the Yggdrasil Codex doesn't hurt. In fact, Ambassador Saren requested you personally.
Hal's pulse quickened. The first time humans decrypted a code on the Yggdrasil Codex runestone, it had led to contact with aliens and hinted at the possible divine intervention in the development of the human race. Heady stuff. His mind was scrambling to imagine what new discoveries this could lead to. He took a sip of espresso and wished it was brandy. Who else is on the team? He asked.
I figured we'd send Neela with you. I sent her a message last night asking her to cut her vacation short and grab a transport back to Norvik. She's on her way as we speak. We have a cryptographer from Earth, Elnora Coleman. She's already on Alfheim, so she'll meet you there. Is there anybody else you think you might need?
Sounds good for now. Let me get there and assess the situation. Then we'll see if we need anybody else.
Perfect. And the Alfar will put their experts at your disposal so you can round out the team with their folks.
Are they expecting us to leave tomorrow?
The governor nodded. Sorry.
Siobhan isn't going to be happy. That's 3 weeks there, plus mission time, 3 weeks back, several months all told.
I know. But considering how important this will likely be, I think she'll understand.
Well, she might. Aelin won't. I'll have to bring back a damn expensive gift to make up for this. Any nice rocks in Alfheim, boss? As Hal opened the ground car door, his wristcom beeped, indicating a message. He tapped a button and read the display. Eyes only. When a stellarcom was in use, it was also capable of sending and receiving a burst of data traffic for additional high-priority information, such as this. He got into his ground car and adjusted the variable tint on his windows to maximum opacity, and then read the message. Start message. From President Rakundo. Haldor, there's more to this mission than there seems on the surface. We suspect one of your team will be a spy. Planted by whom, we don't know. Please take all necessary precautions and report back ASAP when you have more intel. End message. Well, that is interesting, he thought. The SID was quick to realize colony surveying was the perfect cover for more sensitive activities. Hal's previous military service with Earth's stellar fleet was an asset, and in his current job, Hal explored dozens of stars and scores of planets, scanning, gathering, and analyzing data. He was the SID's eyes and ears amongst the stars. Hal had been recruited prior to moving to New Midgard, and so far his role had been uneventful. He'd undergone several months of intense training to prepare for the trouble that had yet to appear, perhaps until now. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you want more free stories in audiobook or ebook form, head over to my website and subscribe for updates. www.hughblong.com.
I'll also be offering subscribers all kinds of cool benefits like advance access to my novels and short stories, free original artwork to my books, and more. See you soon.